And I'm especially pleased to welcome Amr Kotb, who is an expert on the region. He's an expert on Egypt, but also looks at U.S.-Egypt relations through the lens of aid and aid packages. And that's what we'll focus on this evening. So for years, if I'm not mistaken, Egypt was the largest recipient of U.S. aid. And how have things evolved recently? Because for years, I believe it was Egypt number one, and then Israel was number two.
Yeah, it was actually Israel number one.
I see.
Egypt number two. And thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, I think that, Egypt for a long time was the number one recipient as far as Arab countries are concerned of military aid. And a lot of that came down to a certain belief in Egypt's strategic value to the region overall. Egypt is the most populous country in the Middle East. Egypt has the Suez Canal, which is the route, through the Mediterranean as far as, for oil travel. The political significance, the cultural significance. So an investment in Egypt in a lot of ways was an investment for the region. And I think that in recent years, you've seen Egypt's role in the region as a hegemon that we saw in the 60s and 70s go on the decline. And aid to Egypt has sort of mirrored that as a result. As it's become less significant, the United States, has invested less and less in the value of economic programs. Economic aid used to be around $400 million. Just in this past Appropriations Act, it went down to $112 million. So it's really coming down to, it's becoming more and more a security relationship.
So when we were talking about these large aid packages and when Israel was number one and Egypt was number two, what types of numbers are we talking about?
Sure. I mean, so we're talking about, you could say, right now we're looking at Egypt gets 1.3 billion in foreign military financing every year. Now that's money that the U.S. gives to Egypt to buy U.S. equipment. And so we're talking about M1A1 Abrams tanks. We're talking about helicopters, Harpoon missiles, sort of the big prestige stuff. And that number has been pretty solid since 1983. They've gotten 1.3 billion every single year. Now, the economic aid is a little bit of a different story. Like I was saying, as recent as the Bush administration, I think it was around 400 million or so, and then it went down to about 250 million, and just last year went all the way down to 112 and a half.
Right, so 25% of what it was just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And we're now living in an era and through an administration which does not look favorably upon giving money to other countries,
right.
Giving favor to other countries, whether they're trade favor or even as we recently found out with the NATO summit, unwilling to participate in the generous way that the United States has in the recent past, demanding that other countries also participate at a much higher level.
Right.
So I imagine that there's a fair amount of pressure from the administration itself on those who are the appropriators in Congress. And are you seeing that as the direct effect, or are there other aspects of the aid equation that
Sure.
Congress itself is looking at and saying, maybe it is worthy of dropping that amount?
Right. Well, we're in actually a really kind of weird and unique situation when it comes to aid to Egypt because myself, other organizations like the Tahrir Institute, a lot of folks in Congress, particularly the Senate, there have been these long-held issues with Egypt aid. We give them 1.3 billion every year, but they still got a terrorism problem. We give them all this money to buy, reconnaissance equipment or fiber optics or this sort of thing, but they want the tanks, they want the Harpoon missiles, they want the Apache helicopters. The military itself has been engaged in human rights violations in conducting its war on terror, things like extrajudicial killings, torture, mass arrests. So this has been a big voice of critique coming out of the think tank community in Washington, policy groups. And so when Trump came along, we totally thought that he was just going to embrace Sisi, the president of Egypt right now. Sisi's kind of a strong man. He's an autocrat, that sort of thing. And it's been really weird because he has sort of embraced them on the surface. They're buddies. He compliments his shoes at the UNGA. He said he was a fabulous guy. It was a direct quote. He resumed joint training exercises that had ended under the Obama administration. But then he goes and holds up aid. He held up $300 million in aid last year. And that was something that we didn't expect. And the reason that he gave was human rights, which is interesting considering some things he said about some other leaders, and Egypt's relations with North Korea, which I think that's probably more of what that was about. But then after he did that, I feel like his decision, and like you said earlier, Marcos, about sort of just wanting to cut aid in general, so his decision kind of empowered those critical voices. So he said it was about human rights. Whether it is or it's not, that's what he said. So then that empowered the Senate to go and make more cuts in their appropriations bills. And so that's why we're starting to see more and more foreign military financing becoming conditional on democracy and human rights.
Well, it is interesting because it's not a standard he's holding across the board. He himself and our previous Secretary of State Tillerson said that human rights was not going to be a leading issue and a concern as we conduct our foreign policy in the United States. So it is interesting that this would be the lead argument in looking at how our aid packages will be formulated for Egypt. But you brought up a couple of things within that analysis, and one of them specifically being the question of North Korea. I think the North Koreans have the largest embassy in the Arab world in Egypt, if I'm not mistaken, are using it as a profit center in many ways. I think there was a case of military arms actually being smuggled through the embassy via a diplomatic pouch. It can be a very large pouch, but right. it could be a means for redistribution of weapons and for profit making within the African continent. And so maybe you can address that other concern, not just the human rights one, because that is a bit of a conundrum. But
yes.
How about the question of North Korea and Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, North Korea and Egypt have relations, and the United States is pretty mad about it. Trump actually called President Sisi of Egypt back in July of last year, and direct quote from the White House readout said, "I want you to stop hosting, North Korean workers. I want you to stop being an economic hub for North Korea." And this was around the time of, Rocket Man and, Balls of Fires of Fury or whatever all that stuff was. So it was a very salient issue at the time. And then what happens a month later, 300 million held up in aid to Egypt. Unprecedented. Never seen that. Not from, the Obama administration was thought to be more pro-democracy and human rights. They never really came close to doing something like that. So I think it was at the top of the agenda, and even in the bill that passed in fiscal year 18, the final bill saying, what all these countries are going to get from the United States, there was language in there about Egypt specifically complying with UNSC 2270, which was all about sanctions on North Korea. So it's a new issue. It might be hot just because of President Trump's, I don't know, I guess you could say opinions. I don't know what's going to happen next now, though, with the moves that the United States and North Korea have been making, the agreement that they signed in concept. I don't know if that could have an effect on Egypt as a result. Perhaps it would be less of an issue.
Right, but it wouldn't affect this year's aid package regardless.
Right. We'd be looking at fiscal year 19.
Right.
Which, so both the House and the Senate have passed their bills, and obviously the president's budget is out. So now we're waiting for the bill, but that could take a really long time, especially with the elections coming up here in the U.S. So, last year they passed, I think, 6 continuing resolutions. So it was spring by the time the budget came out. So plenty of time to see what will happen. It really does get down to the wire.
So we've talked about human rights as a potential sticking point regarding how the United States wants to support and aid Egypt. We've talked about North Korea, but there are clearly other potential irritants. regarding the U.S. and Egyptian relationship, and some of them are regional, some of them are geopolitical. Certainly, and I don't know where to start really, but let's stay in the neighborhood.
Sure.
Let's say one of the things that we've seen with the Trump administration, and President Trump in particular, but also with his son-in-law, is a tightening of relations with Saudi Arabia and with the up-and-coming leadership with Mohammed bin Salman. Egypt has played a game that's a little hard to understand sometimes. They're somewhat independent in the Saudi's foreign policies, whether it be in Yemen or in Qatar, and I could see perhaps that this administration would want to have more of a clarity from Egypt in an alliance with what the United States sees as a very strong U.S.-Saudi relationship.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because a lot of people might be looking at these adjustments now and saying, oh, great, now human rights is on the agenda. We're going to start making these cuts. We're going to see what happens. But, hey, this is a pretty rough neighborhood, right? I think that's basically what you're getting at. So the United States can only do so much because, you're right, Egypt has pursued a very non-committal policy of alliances when it comes to the region. And the Saudi Arabia example is great because Egypt obviously secured billions from Saudi Arabia several years ago when Sisi first came into power after the overthrow of Morsi. And since then, Saudi Arabia is kind of like, hey, we want something for all this money we're giving you. And a few years ago, we saw that Egypt transferred 2 maritime islands to Saudi Arabia, right? Tiran and Sanafir. Yes. That was a huge deal. A lot of people were mad about that. The point of it is, though, that Egypt is playing along with Saudi, but then it's not at the same time. It doesn't want to commit to troops in Yemen, for example. It is not going to be part of this trans-Arab force that's going to take down ISIS. You know, Michael Bolton called Sisi and said, we want Egyptian troops to commit to this. And they're probably not going to do that. Even if they did, there's certain competency concerns, but that's another topic. So that really remains to be seen. The U.S. is very frustrated with the position they find themselves in, because even if they are upset with the way Egypt is playing this game, and the same with Syria, by the way, because Egypt is increasingly relying on Russia for arms transfers and arms sales and that sort of thing. And so that means that every once in a while they're aligning with Russia on the Syria question, and then Russia is opposite of Saudi Arabia on the Syria question. So that is a conundrum for the United States that it's going to have to figure out how to get out of.
Right. Well, you've jumped straight to the geopolitical question, which is Russia, of course, and Syria being the most clear case of where, regionally at least, Egypt has aligned with some of the Russian interests. But it goes beyond that, really, because, and we saw this, of course, in the middle of the 20th century when Egypt had a very strong relationship with Russia. We're able to have a dam built for them, but when you look at contemporary Egypt, you actually see arms sales that are now being agreed to, and most importantly, I think, on an economic front, this new nuclear power plant, which has just been agreed upon between Russia. I think it's a $30 billion plant.
Yeah.
These are significant deals. You know, I'm sure that the Trump administration and the United States would prefer that it was a GE or a Westinghouse plant that was being put into Egypt. Could you talk a bit about how that, if it's not a realignment, at least a rebuilding of a relationship with Russia is evolving, and why it's happening now?
Sure. I think that there's 2 things happening, right? And so from the Russian perspective, you know, Vladimir Putin is someone who kind of came into office as being on the raw end of the sort of the blowback from the fall of the USSR and Warsaw Pact countries going over to NATO and all of that sort of thing. And so there were several things he did to sort of, even though the economy wasn't doing so well in Russia, there were certain things that he did to raise the profile of Russia. And, he started meddling with a lot of these former Soviet countries. Estonia was one of them, for example, all the way down to when, they actually meddled in the U.S. elections. And obviously what happened in Ukraine Georgia, etc. So Russia is very much seeking, putting itself within schisms and conflicts and exacerbating those conflicts as a means of establishing international credibility. So the Middle East is open waters for them to do that because there's so many cleavages, there's so many conflicts. It's increasingly destabilizing. The Gulf crisis, Yemen, Syria, everybody knows all about that. So Russia is conscious of that and using that to its advantage. Then you got Egypt's perspective. Egypt is becoming increasingly frustrated with the Obama administration. They did not like the way that the administration reacted to what they called the revolution, the second revolution, the June 30 revolution that brought Sisi to power. There was a lot of distrust and suspicion. They started to hold up all the economic programs, the aid that was going, and then the Obama administration categorized that military aid that we're talking about because they were so annoyed that the Egyptians kept doing what one State Department official told me, focusing on toys to play with, so tanks and all that kind of stuff, instead of counterinsurgency stuff that they need. So they said the aid had to fall into 4 categories, and then they ended cash flow financing, which means that used to allow the Egyptians to buy military equipment on credit. Buy now, pay later, pay however you want, etc. Now they have to have the money in the account if they're going to buy something. So there was a lot of distrust, and they started thinking like, okay, how can we, 1, hedge our bets, make sure we're still getting what we want from other countries, and 2, how can we push the United States a little bit? How can we push its buttons? So they went to other sellers, and France is one of them, Germany, but they specifically went to Russia as well because I think, my personal opinion, I think that they saw that as a way to get under the U.S.'s skin, because the biggest question always when we talk about aid is, well, if we don't give them the weapons, they're going to get them from somewhere else. Right. So they're playing into that fear a little bit.
So you're saying that it's in essence a bit of a reaction and maybe a bit of a petulance to the Obama administration and President Obama himself personally, but that's carrying over now into this new administration, and that once you've reestablished this relationship, which is a long-standing relationship, I think we have to recognize that there is a historic relationship between, then the Soviets, but now the Russians. But it is concerning, I think, for anyone who is a close observer of the region and the relationship between U.S. and Egypt, that Russia is, in essence, performing a much more aggressive and much more assertive policy in the region, and that they have a receptivity in Egypt, if not an open arms welcoming, I think is going to be of concern, if not to the administration necessarily and to Donald Trump personally, then probably to Congress and the Senate.
Definitely. I mean, that's the number one concern you hear from Congress, a lot of folks in Congress, and the number one issue that complicates this aid question and trying to make it more contingent upon democracy and human rights, which, fulfilling democracy and human rights requirement is actually in the interest of security. But we can digress on that a little bit if we have time.
Sure, yeah.
But what you hear people saying more and more is that Egypt is on the front lines. ISIS is in Sinai right now. So we need to make sure that they are able to fight this insurgency. So that's why the military aid is such a touchy topic, and that's why when Trump, of all people, withheld it, there was such a ripple effect.
Well, we can go to human rights, as you suggest, and as you look at the administration in Egypt, I think one thing that you can say verily about the leadership is that they are an anti-Islamist, anti-Muslim Brotherhood government, that they do not brook this very easily, that they are actively trying to suppress any instances of this Islamist outbreak because they've experienced it and they've actually had to have overthrown it actively. So what usually happens when you have that type of activity from a government and with a military that's willing to work hand in glove with the government is a secondary concern for human rights issues and for civil rights in general. So could you address that a bit and that tension? Because if we're pushing from the United States to, in fact, shut down and crack down on these extremist groups, well, that tends to also affect the society on a much broader level and negates the interests on human rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that when you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood right now, I think that the government in Egypt has used that as a way to crack down on dissent in all ways possible. A really great example of that is over the past 8 weeks in Egypt, the government has been arresting a lot of secular activists, satirical artists, human rights defenders. One woman who made a Facebook post about sexual harassment in Egypt and how it's unacceptable. So these arrests have been happening with unprecedented levels of severity, intensity, precision. Excuse me. Now, the charge in a lot of these cases has been disrupting national security and being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's crazy because these people are secular. They're not involved in any religious activity. So that's one side of the question, right? Is that it's more political. Using the Muslim Brotherhood accusation is more political, and it's a way to sideline actual peaceful dissent, which is necessary right now, given the economic situation, the need for NGOs, the need for people to address issues. People say civil society is the unofficial fourth branch of government, right? So you're costing yourself that partner. Then the second part to it is that you actually have a real insurgency happening in Sinai. People who have pledged allegiance to ISIS. You have attacks happening. You had 305 people killed at a mosque in October, the deadliest attack in Egypt's history. And are you addressing those actual terrorists? What are you doing to address that security threat? And it doesn't seem like, if we want to prioritize security, like you said, and we want to think about the Muslim Brotherhood piece and the human rights piece, well, then our priority should be making sure that this threat is being addressed tactically. The doctrine of the military is very conventional. It doesn't respond to an insurgency threat, like I was saying earlier. So those are kind of the two aspects, is that focusing on the Muslim Brotherhood, it diverts attention from actual counterinsurgency tactics that are not being employed, and it's being used to stifle dissent. And it sows instability, it sows mistrust in the government, it leaves people with grievances towards the government. So in the long term, what I share with a lot of policymakers in DC is that sustaining this policy or sustaining this government actually is pushing us towards the instability that we don't want.
So, I mean, I hear the skepticism and I hear the challenge that you are clearly raising, but what are the incentives then to either incentivize the government of Egypt or the military branch so that it can actually achieve these counterinsurgency tactical approaches that are necessary to actually be effective against ISIS, and to the extent that there are extremist factions and members of the Muslim Brotherhood, to be able to actually address that very credible threat or issue?
Yeah, I mean, the incentives are lacking, to be frank with you. The one area of leverage that the United States had in the past was aid and assistance. And that was kind of something that we could use to incentivize, excuse me, but it wasn't being used for fear of the Egyptians walking away from the table and going to get aid from somebody else. But the bottom line is that the military assistance that the United States gives Egypt is truly unparalleled. It's superior. And I don't say that as some kind of hyper-patriotic American. I say that from a purely nuts and bolts perspective. The systems that we've given the Egyptians for their military equipment, it would be hard for them to integrate new weaponry with those systems. So that's an incentive that the United States can use and can say, look, we know you have a real terrorism problem. This is a constructive partnership and a strategic alliance, and we want to help you address it. And I think that what the Trump administration has done, whether intentional or not, it seems to be making some new headway. I don't know if I would say it's great yet, but they've refrained from public criticism that we saw during the Obama days. And then underneath that public criticism, it's created a space for dialogue and been able to make some difficult decisions.
But it also seems that you're saying that our strongest leverage point is the military and the military aid. So the 1.3 billion that we're giving, if Congress and Senate have made their point and President Trump has stopped the attack on the president and at least lowered the temperature on the human rights conversation,
right,
then how do you look to Secretary Mattis and his organization and say, look, you've got the greatest incentive of all. You've got the equipment, you've got the money, you've got the relationships at the senior levels of these institutions, of these military institutions. How do you then tell him, what do you tell him to do in those circumstances, especially with such a monolith as the Egyptian military?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would tell Mattis is that we could focus on some of the more nuts and boltsy aspects of counterinsurgency. So, for example, the United States gives Egypt this equipment, and they don't have access to Sinai. So they don't know how that equipment's being used. They don't know what's being done with it. The Egyptians won't give it to them. So I think being able to push for access to Sinai, for example, to be able to monitor the way things are going, or to push the generals in Egypt to be more receptive to a change in doctrine, how they actually view the insurgency. So I think that we have the knowledge, we have the information. Like you said, it's a monolith. It's a difficult. The people on the other end are not necessarily receptive to our suggestions, but I think that they want the aid at the end of the day. It is superior aid. And so there's some wiggle room there that we as an organization at Tahrir Institute, we don't believe that aid should be cut, actually. We think the aid is necessary. We just think it needs to be changed around a little bit to be the right stuff, the right intelligence, so that when the military or when officers go out to the Western Desert to go after some kind of militant hideout, their cell phones aren't not working, or they aren't being told to shoot on sight, or they aren't going there with bad intelligence. That's the stuff that they need. And that's the stuff that's embarrassing the country when it comes to their international standing.
Well, Sinai keeps coming up because it really is now the hotbed, and it has been infected. I think we can use that word, which the president likes to use, by ISIS and by its adherents. But of course, Egypt is not the only country that borders the Sinai. To what extent do relations with Jordan and with Israel help in this particular attempt to minimize and destroy ISIS? How are those? Is the United States pushing Egypt, for instance, to have greater relations with Egypt and Jordan to actually work together on these counterinsurgency functions?
I'm not sure if we are pushing Egypt, but I know that over the past several years, Egypt-Israel relations are at an all-time high as far as cooperation is concerned, particularly security cooperation. The Egyptian government has given the Israeli government permission to conduct drone strikes in the Sinai, for example. And some would argue that the Israeli government or the Israeli military is actually more effective at addressing this issue than Egypt is. So I don't know how much the United States has pushed that, but I know that the United States is pleased with that alliance, and that is another hurdle when we were talking about considerations in the region.
Yes.
With these cuts, is a lot of people in Congress might turn around and say, well, hey, Egypt's got great relations with Israel. They're cooperating to defeat terrorism in the Sinai. If we cut the military aid, would it put that at risk? So, the short answer is that yes, the Egypt relations with Israel are going very well and are seen as instrumental to addressing the insurgency.
Great. Well, what we do here is we regularly have questions from the audience, and I've got a stack of a few here.
Okay.
And so I'll just pick up, and a little bit of it is actually about the human rights issues. One of our audience members asks, can you talk about the freedom of speech issues in Egypt? And with that, I think it's also tied into the question of journalism and the free press in that country. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's it's an abhorrent situation right now with regard to freedom of speech and media and journalists. I think that, like I said, what you'll see in a lot of these human rights situations or crackdown on civil society is the false intertwining with security. And a great example of that is something called the counter-terror law that Egypt passed a few years ago, where the government has actually criminalized journalists' ability to report numbers on security incidents that differ from the government's line. So you have people, a great example was in October, there was a big attack in the Western Desert, the one I was talking about earlier, where the government said, 15 officers were killed. And then these foreign media outlets were coming out saying, actually it was 55. So that's a huge issue because journalists can't do their job. They can't inform the public about how serious this terrorist threat is. And as a result, that leaves us a media opacity that extremists and militants can exploit for themselves. So it's ironic that it's a rich irony that the government says that it's cracking down or passing the counter-terror law for the sake of security when security is actually the thing that's being put at risk as a result. And it's not only security. We see it with the presidential election that happened earlier this year. Journalists and organizations that were reporting potential issues of voter fraud were being shut down. Heads of news outlets were being sacked. So it's a very tough situation right now.
So the 97% victory that el-Sisi won may not have been a full 97%? Is that what you're saying?
It may have been 97% of the people who turned out. I'm not sure, to be honest with you, yeah. But I don't know how much of a turnout there was. Since
we're talking about journalism from the last question, can you talk a bit about the broadcast networks? I mean, are they government run? Is that how the television radio functions, or is it a much more open, are the airwaves much more open?
Well, after the revolution, you saw all kinds of channels popping up. A lot of independent media, a lot of independent channels. Bassem Youssef, I don't know if you are familiar with him. He's known as the Egyptian Jon Stewart.
Yes.
He had his satirical media show. He was prolific. And then we saw, as this sort of crackdown on the brotherhood that was exploited to crack down on free speech and dissent, we saw a lot of these channels being shut down. And we saw a lot of channels being slowly taken over by general intelligence or military intelligence, too. Some channels being sold off to military intelligence or general intelligence ownership. So, yes, it's increasingly a state narrative. And also the supposed independent or quasi-independent networks are slowly being co-opted by intelligence.
And in terms of internet access and the ability to get on social media, is that being monitored? Is it fairly free-flowing?
It is being heavily monitored. I remember about a year and a half ago, I was meeting with two folks from the Egypt desk at the State Department. And it was my first meeting with them introducing the organization. And they said, well, what's going on with websites in Egypt? Do they block websites? And I said, things are pretty bad, but it's not China or Saudi Arabia. They don't block websites. As soon as they walked out, there was a report that they had blocked a website called Meda Masr. That's an independent media outlet. I should have mentioned them in response to your first question. Fantastic investigative journalism and really in-depth reporting. And they were the ones actually who were reporting the information I showed on the other attack when it was 15 versus 55. They were the ones who had that information. So that website was blocked, and then we saw the blocked websites just skyrocket up into, it was around 500 last time I checked. I don't know where it is now. So there are blocked websites. Social media, there's always new reports of the government attempts at monitoring social media access and usage. The government actually created something called EG Face. It's supposed to be like Facebook, but for Egyptians. I'm not sure how that's going exactly, but it's unfortunately heavily monitored.
Do they have an EG Tinder as well? Is that?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to ask about that.
Okay. Next time you're in Egypt, make sure you check into that. Look, we have a question here from someone who is an Egyptian Copt in the audience, And he says, whereas the Copts in Egypt are treated significantly better than during the Muslim Brotherhood's reign, is his assertion, el-Sisi progressed only halfway towards equality and justice. And then the question is why? If you agree with the assumption.
Sure. Well, I think that the plight of the Copts is a very challenging and interesting topic, because I think that a lot of Egypt's Coptic Christians were very scared during the Muslim Brotherhood's period, and they saw Sisi as an alternative and someone who would be better than that very scary thing. And Sisi has done some things on the surface that have been a sign that perhaps things are getting better for Coptic Christians. You know, he attended Mass. He passed the church construction law. He rebuilt the churches that were burned after the Muslim Brotherhood was booted. But it's hard for me to agree with the assertion that things are better. I think that, you know, this church construction law, for example, you still have to get approval from the government for the church that you're going to build, and they may not get back to you necessarily. About a year and a half ago, there was a string of murders of Coptic Christians in Arish and Sinai. A lot of people leaving home, fleeing, some people fleeing and coming back and still being killed. The government hasn't done much in the sense of providing a legal framework for Coptics, when their churches are burned down or when they're attacked in the streets. They still rely on reconciliation councils, which is ineffective. So I think it's still pretty dire. And I believe that the government has historically viewed Coptic Christians as second-class citizens, and it's going to take a pretty substantive, significant change for that to be altered.
Well, that's depressing. Especially as we're talking about human rights and religious rights and freedom of speech and the types of things that we really are promoting, even regardless of administration across the world, even if we do it to various degrees over time. But that really is saddening in that, I should, those of you who know my last name, you know I'm a Greek American, and there is as well a Greek minority that lives within Egypt.
Absolutely.
So I've been able to visit, for instance, some of the churches within Cairo and elsewhere. So I'm saddened to hear that. So we have someone here who's rather critical of our own government, who's asking a question. Looking at the revolution in Egypt, what can Americans learn about addressing an aggressive government?
Wow.
So lessons perhaps from the revolution and from the Arab Spring or awakening, or however you want to refer to that moment.
Yeah. It's a loaded and good question.
Yes. That's why it's on the top of the stack.
Right. I think definitely, after spending some time in Egypt a few years ago and coming back and then seeing things have been happening here, there has been some weird parallels for me. So I have thought about this question before. And I feel like what can Americans learn from Egyptians? I think, the revolution in Egypt, it relied quite a bit on grassroots and social media. And social media at that time was really seen, and technology in general in some ways, was seen as a tool of liberation and freedom and equality and egalitarianism and plurality. But what's interesting now, so many years later, is that those same tools are being flipped onto the citizenry, and the governments, a lot of oppressive governments, are using them against their citizens in order to deny them of a lot of their rights. So, I think that's one thing we could learn is that the world has changed as far as social media is concerned. It's not necessarily this tool for liberation. I think also the revolution was amazing while it was happening, but in the end, it's not over yet. We'll see. But today, it's a sad state of affairs, and I think that we should be wary of those who are in power, the governments. We should be aware of the fact that it takes more than just kind of going out in the streets, is what I would say. And that was great, but at the end of the day, that movement removed Hosni Mubarak. There was still a whole whole other system underneath that. So I think that's one thing we can learn, is that, it's more than just mass action and protest.
Right. Well, I'm sure this is an ongoing story both in Egypt and the United States, so we'll continue to monitor and look to other countries, Egypt and elsewhere, for models and for examples of how we engage civically and politically. Since you mentioned Hosni Mubarak, one of the questions that came up here is, do the people of Egypt enjoy more freedoms in recent years than they would have had Mubarak remained in power? And as we recall, part of what had happened during the Mubarak days was that, in fact, there was some loosening of civil liberties, and some even argue in the political science field that it was this generation of at least a burgeoning middle class and some of the civil liberties that were being enjoyed by them that allowed for the dissent to grow and for the organization of opposition to form. So could you address that? Is it now more free, or was it where what was budding during the end of Mubarak more free?
Well, I'm not sure I would say budding, but I would say that yes, it was more free at the time. I think that civil society was becoming more and more active. There were more NGOs that were operating. There was a bigger, as we know, American presence. Groups like the National Democratic Institute, IRI, etc. They were very visible in Egypt and doing a lot of democracy promotion and that sort of thing. And then, of course, a lot of Egyptian organizations conducting valuable human development initiatives, etc. So, I think that in Mubarak's days, there's a saying called "walk next to the wall," imshi جنب الحيط. And I think that in Mubarak's days, everybody knew where that wall was. There were certain things you just didn't do. Like, maybe you could increasingly trash the office of the president, but you still couldn't trash the military, for example. And now, we got somebody doing a Facebook post with Sisi with Mickey Mouse ears on his head, and he's going to jail. So things are different, for sure. But at the same time, I caution people from thinking that that is a justification for, hey, this revolution shouldn't have happened. Because I think that ignores the aspirations of the people on the ground, who were they had legitimate grievances. The economic policies that benefited, a small group of people at the top, the youth unemployment, there was still a lack of free speech. They had a right to that revolution. You know what I mean? And I think that's really important and can get lost when you look at how things have turned out so far.
Yeah, well, I was there just prior to the revolution, and I remember being surprised, in fact, to the degree that at least the man on the street felt free to express some opinion. I remember talking to somebody and pointing to a picture of Mubarak and someone saying, yes, the last pharaoh, and thinking, well, he is clearly ready for the president to go at the time. You mentioned also in your analysis of these two periods, a number of non-governmental organizations, the NGOs that we really rely on outside of governmental aid to actually be able to go into other countries and help build civil society, this fourth branch of society that is so key to its healthy functioning. But as around the world, and this is also true in Egypt, NGOs are experiencing a very different environment. They're not as welcomed. In certain cases, they're actually they're subject to arrest, members of those NGOs. What is now happening with the NGOs that are in Egypt, the types of ones that you mentioned, IRI, NDI, NED, these various organizations?
Yeah, well, so a lot of people are familiar with what happened in 2012, 2013, was what was known as the NGO trial, or the foreign funding case, or case 173. Our executive director, Nancy Al-Khail at the Tahrir Institute, she was working for Freedom House at the time. And many people are familiar with that jarring image of these NGOs, Freedom House and NDI and IRI, being raided by security forces. and then a lot of these people being tried in court. And our executive director got a 5-year sentence in absentia. She's been unable to return ever since. Now, that's been a big sticking point in Egypt-U.S. relations, and that was kind of just part one. In March 2016, the government reopened the case and began focusing on a lot of the local NGOs. A lot of people had their assets frozen. A lot of people are on travel bans. They can't leave the country. And that case is ongoing. And people continue to be called for questioning, and we'll see what happens with that. And then sort of the kicker was the passage of the NGO law, which was, I believe, May 2017. And that does everything but really criminalize being an NGO in Egypt. They formed an authority that sort of monitors all NGO activity. There's security institutions and apparatuses that are part of that authority. You have to get the government's written approval to receive any foreign funding. So that was actually a former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said that was a big part of why he made the decision, the Trump administration made the decision to hold up the aid last year. So it's very hard to be an NGO right now in Egypt. And just like I said, this recent spate of arrests that we've seen, a lot of these people are NGO workers or affiliated with NGOs, and it's increasingly becoming criminalized.
Is your organization facing a challenge as a result of all this?
We definitely face a challenge because the Tahrir Institute really is all about local actors. That's our thing. We want to make sure that policymakers know what people on the ground want. And so we rely on people reporting on security in Sinai. We rely on el-Nadim, an organization that seeks to hold security officials accountable for torture, for example, and provide rehabilitative services for those who have been tortured. So it makes it hard for us to do our jobs. And when we're in meetings with policy folks, we try to make that point clear that, this crackdown is also hurting U.S. policy because all of the reports that we do, everything we tell you about the parliament, the security, the elections, we can't do it without the people on the ground. And they are increasingly under threat.
Right. We started this conversation talking about aid and aid from the United States. And part of the reason that aid is so important is that the economy is unable to support itself, that the functioning of whether they be small or large businesses just isn't generating enough wealth or isn't distributing it enough to have a functioning, strong economy. And so one of the questions that we have here from the audience is, what fraction of the Egyptian economy depends on tourism? And this is my understanding is that it's always been a fairly significant part of the economy. Right. Is this fraction increasing or decreasing? Do tourists believe Egypt is safe or not? So I guess it's every question really that you can imagine regarding tourism.
Yeah.
And if you haven't been, go, by the way.
Yes, I second that, even now.
Yes.
I think that the Egyptian economy is largely dependent on a few things. One is tourism. The other is remittances from citizens who are abroad, people living away from home, sending money back. Another is property construction and building sort of big compounds where upper-class folks live. So, yes, tourism is huge, and it has taken a massive hit. I think I think it started coming back about 2 or 3 years ago, so it's slowly on the rise again. I would say that it's definitely safe to go. I was there in 2014, and I went to Aswan and Loksor, and it definitely felt like I was the only one there, which was kind of nice. But it's integral to the Egyptian economy, and it's struggling. Even though it's on the rise, I think it's still excuse me, I think it's still improving by single digits or something like that. So it's not doing very well.
Right. So I imagine the exchange rate's pretty good right now for an American going over there.
Yeah. Well, they have some serious inflation. I mean, it was in the 30s recently. I think it got down to 11. I think it's back up to 14 now once they floated the currency. So they got things in control, and they got this IMF loan. But the thing with that is that, the IMF, the loans that they give Egypt, the way they view success is often these sort of macroeconomic indicators. I mean, in 2007, 8, 9, 10, people loved Egypt's economy, 7% growth, top performer from the World Bank. You had a revolution a couple years later, and a legitimate revolution, like we said, because the wealth that's created isn't shared. It's not equitable development. You still have serious youth unemployment. So that's, if I could just tack on 2 cents there, I just feel like that's something that might be being missed right now, is even if things are on the rebound, what lens are we using to evaluate Egypt's progress?
And before I go to the next question here, you've mentioned twice now youth unemployment, and those of us who've been following some of the developments in Europe may be aware that in Greece, for instance, youth unemployment is at 50%, and it's part of the depression that the country is feeling. Not a recession; it's an ongoing recession, but now it's fully a depression, and they're finally now experiencing some uptick, or maybe a pulse, I think, can be now felt. What are we talking about in terms of Egypt and its youth unemployment rate?
I think it's in the low 30s or upper 20s%.
Right. So Greeks will be going to Egypt to get jobs. Is that what you're
saying? Yeah. It wouldn't be the first time, right?
That's
Hopefully,
exactly right.
They won't get kicked out this time.
So. Yes. So we've got a few more questions here. One of them is about military and arms. And the question is, what is the likelihood Sisi pivots away from the U.S. for purposes of obtaining military armaments elsewhere? And, if I can tack on to that, the role of the military and the centrality of the military in the economy and its ownership of a good part of the economic well-being of the country, whether it be industry or even tourist hotels in certain instances. Yeah. I mean, they really are pervasive. And so given, in some ways, the autonomy of the military as an economic entity within Egypt, does that also give them the opportunity to pivot away from the United States if they wanted to?
Right. So I think as far as pivoting away from the United States with arms, I would go back to what I was saying earlier about the superiority of U.S. arms and the fact that it would be difficult to really sort of remake everything from scratch and just the operability of the systems. But that doesn't mean that's not to say that that's not an issue, and we're seeing it. I think there was a report that came out not too long ago that said that in the past 4 years, the greatest arms exported to Egypt was actually France. Germany is very high up there. Russia is very high up there. These are all new trends. And yes, we have a president right now who's not necessarily a fan of the effectiveness of military assistance. So it's two competing issues there, is that, yes, it's superior, but there's some cuts and adjustments right now that may be pushing them elsewhere, and they are going elsewhere. To what extent will they continue going elsewhere? It's hard to say. As far as the military's position within Egyptian society, absolutely, you're 100% right. It's pervasive. The military presents itself as a force above the fray, really. It's not just that they defend Egypt and that they're such an indispensable piece to the national identity and the fabric, but it's that they also provide for Egypt. They provide goods and services. They, like you said, hotels. They build highways. They build infrastructure. They sell baby formula. I mean, they really do a lot. So they've created a situation where it's very difficult to criticize them. And we don't even know what their budget is. There's no transparency. And I think that that's purely domestic. I don't see that transferring to the international realm, because they want that weaponry, and they're standing within their own country. It makes them a powerful force and one of the biggest armies. I don't know about effective, but one of the biggest armies in the region. So that's something they can use to get the stuff that they want. But beyond that, I don't really see it making a huge difference.
Right. So maybe once they start exporting baby formula, then we'll worry about their economic independence. And in the meantime, we'll see that $1.3 billion going their way from the United States. We have a specific question here, someone who clearly is paying attention to what's going on domestically, and it's about the status of a photojournalist named Shawkin,
Yes.
who received the 2018 UNESCO Press Freedom Prize. Since this is a clear human rights violation, to hold him in prison for 5 years for a trumped-up charge. Is this a situation that is, I'm sorry, I can't read this, but in essence, how is that both affecting USAID, and what is his status, if you know?
So yeah, what you said is right. He's a photojournalist that was present at the dispersal of the pro-Morsi protest that happened after he was ousted. He was picked up and has been held for a very long time. His time in prison has exceeded the legal pretrial detention that he's permitted to be held for. There's a very strong international campaign surrounding his case, and it's just been getting postponed and adjourned over and over and over and over again. Sometimes that's something that the government will do to exhaust the campaign a little bit, and we saw that happen with the NGO trial, where our director received the sentence. So most recently, he was supposed to have a hearing. They were supposed to reach a verdict, I think about 2 weeks ago, and it got adjourned to July 25th, I believe. But the campaign is very strong around him. Marco Rubio is a senator who's actually been pretty active on Shawkin's case. The UN has been very active. UNESCO, like you mentioned, gave him an award. So we'll see what happens. But his case it embodies so much of what's going on right now as far as the government's repressive tactics and measures.
Before we close this out this evening, we talked earlier about the regional players that Egypt has a relationship with, those who both have an adversarial relationship with the United States, but also those that have a very tight and tightening relationship, such as Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. But I want to make sure that before we close this evening out, we talk about at least two other players in the region, because they are so significant, and one being Turkey and the other being Iran. Turkey, if I'm not mistaken, has been very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood traditionally. I don't know if that's still the case, and with Erdogan's re-election, or rather elevation, really, to extension of power, and really taking over of Turkey in almost every aspect of its political leadership. And then secondarily, of course, Iran, since when you talk about Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the unspoken when we talk about Yemen or Syria is the role that Iran is playing within that region. So if you could address those two countries, Egypt's role, and maybe it's the same as it is with Saudi Arabia, but I imagine they have a different standing, perhaps, with those other two countries.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think with Turkey, you have a situation where there's a lot of members of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, who have been sort of self-exiled over there. And I know that the Egyptian government would like to bring those people back to Egypt and try them, and that is certainly a thorn in their side. I think another challenge is that the Egyptian government has gone to such great lengths to paint the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and it's in Turkey it's a political party that's in power, so it complicates their narrative for Turkey to be a government that actually has members of the Muslim Brotherhood in power, and it's a blurred line, and it's between someone who's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and then somebody, some of these younger cadres who have split off and then joined some of the more violent and militant groups. That's why it's been so challenging for the Egyptian government to get the United States to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, because it's so splintered, and Turkey is a challenge to that. When it comes to Iran, I think that it's really, you see some of it play out in Syria a little bit, where Russia and Iran have been in the past. It's increasingly kind of splintering a bit, that alliance, but they're they're aligned in Syria, and so that kind of pushes Egypt into that alliance sometimes, but then sometimes not. So I think that's not something I'm super schooled upon, but I think that's an area where Egypt can play that into what we were talking about earlier about this foreign policy where they don't have allegiance to any one power. So while Turkey may be a challenge for them, Iran is a tool that they might be able to use when interacting with some of the more anti-Iran states.
Well, Amr Kotb, it's been a fascinating evening. Really found it fascinating to talk about Egypt and the U.S.-Egypt relationship. And it's been a China-free evening. We have all the nations that we discussed. We did not discuss the other great power in the world. Perhaps next time you come, we'll talk about China and Egypt.
Sounds great.
But thank you for coming this evening, and this concludes the radio portion of the evening.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.